Beneath the quiet ground we walk every day, entire worlds are hidden. Colossal chambers carved as if by unseen hands, tunnels spiraling into darkness with no beginning, no end, and megastructures so precise they defy the tools of their time. They were sealed, abandoned, or forgotten. Yet their walls whisper of something vast, purposeful, and unsettling. Why did ancient builders carve downward instead of upward? Why do so many of these places show signs of planning without explanation, engineering without context, and secrets without answers? As we descend into the earth, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Someone built these places for a reason. And whatever that reason was, they never wanted it revealed. Wieliczka salt mine. Beneath the quiet contours of southern Poland, the Wieliczka salt mine stretches into the earth like a vast inverted cathedral carved over centuries. Its origins in the medieval search for precious brine, gradually transforming into a subterranean world where geology and human persistence intertwine in a dim clarity that feels older than recorded memory. And as one descends through corridors darkened by time, but smoothed by generations of hands, the air thickens with the mineral scent of ancient seas trapped in stone, hinting that these depths once lay under waters that have long since receded, leaving behind a landscape that miners shaped into chambers, chapels, and vaulted halls, whose crystalline sculptures catch the faintest glimmer of lamplight, as though they were meant to hold something unspoken. And while the early shafts reveal pragmatic engineering, timber supports blackened by salt, spiral staircases cut with restrained efficiency, and mining tools abandoned mid-century, the deeper levels begin to offer forms that stray from mere extraction, where chambers expand into improbable symmetry, their ceilings supported by pillars that seem too refined for the harsh working conditions that birthed them, blending functional necessity with a shadow of aesthetic intention, as if the miners were responding not only to the demands of labor, but also to a quiet impulse to leave behind markers of their presence in these silent halls. And in the St. Kinga Chapel, where entire altarpieces, reliefs, and chandeliers are carved from salt, the mine's story shifts, suggesting that the boundary between sacred devotion and geological wonder was porous, for the mineral itself became a medium through which artisans expressed narratives that once existed only above ground, raising questions about how such elaborate craftsmanship persisted in an environment known for its dangers, collapses, toxic vapors, and the ever-present risks of deep mining. Yet these works endure with a stillness that conveys both the resilience of faith and the patience of stone. Surrounding tunnels diverge like the spokes of a forgotten wheel, their walls bearing tool marks that repeat with rhythmic regularity until they fade into more erratic patterns, where the structure of the salt altered, as though the miners encountered pockets of unexpected hardness or cavities that forced them to adapt. And in some places, the corridors widen into reservoirs of brackish water, whose glassy surfaces reflect the void above so perfectly that they distort one's sense of orientation, creating impressions of hidden depth that invite speculation about natural chambers lying beyond surveyed boundaries. And, as historians attempt to reconcile legends of labyrinthine extensions with the documented engineering of the mine, they find occasional anomalies, shafts sealed long before official records mention them, stairways that descend to levels without clear purpose, and isolated pockets of air where sound behaves strangely, dampened in some corners and amplified in others, as though the geometry of these spaces interacts with acoustics in ways that have yet to be fully understood, prompting discussions about whether the earliest miners inherited older cavities formed by retreating seas or exploited natural weaknesses in the salt that left traces unlike typical human workmanship. Geological studies reveal layered structures showing the slow crystallization of evaporated marine basins, their stratification interrupted by subtle distortions, hinting at ancient tectonic movements that might have opened hollows now lost behind collapsed walls. And these traces, while scientifically explainable, often inspire comparisons to the mine's more enigmatic sections, where chambers align in patterns that seem almost intentional, following vectors that do not correspond neatly to economic extraction paths, raising the possibility that practical mining occasionally converge with pre-existing voids shaped by forces predating any cultural activity in the region. And although most theories rest firmly on known mining practices, The coexistence of sacred art, engineering precision, and unexplained irregularities leaves room for contemplation about how deeply human hands and geological history intertwine. For the mind's oldest passages echo faintly with the interplay of need, belief, and circumstance, leaving behind a structure that feels simultaneously crafted and discovered, as if the deeper one travels, the more indistinct the boundary becomes between what was carved intentionally and what presented itself as a natural guide. And when the journey returns upward toward the surface, the transition from echoing halls to daylight reinforces the lingering impression that the mind's vast interior harbors more than its documented past reveals, not in the sense of hidden treasures or uncharted kingdoms, but in the quiet suggestion that some ancient environments resist complete interpretation, preserving within their mineral silence a reminder that even in places mapped and measured, something of the Earth's older story remains just beyond the reach of certainty. Hypogeum of Hal Safleeni. Deep beneath the modest streets of Paola, the Hypogeum of Hal Safleeni descends through layers of Maltese limestone in a series of chambers whose shifting light and quiet curvature suggest an intention both practical and ineffably ceremonial, beginning with the upper level where rough-hewn cavities echo the island's earliest attempts to create sheltered spaces and gradually giving way to lower rooms carved with a refinement that seems to respond not only to engineering needs, but to an evolving sense of spatial meaning, for the walls soften into sweeping arcs and recessed niches that catch shadow in measured gradients, hinting at a community attentive to the subtle dialogue between stone and silence. And while the first excavators expected little more than a storage complex or simple burial ground, they found instead a layered architectural sequence whose design principles appear neither haphazard nor purely utilitarian, with entrances aligned in ways that control illumination, floors sculpted to shape movement, and ceilings fashioned in a red ochre swirl that mirrors the decorative vocabulary of Malta's above-ground megalithic temples, though here the patterns feel more intimate, their pigment lingering like faint memory in an air so still it seems to have settled over millennia. Deeper rooms introduce a different character, particularly the so-called oracle chamber, where the carved curves of its walls generate a curious acoustic resonance that causes low tones to vibrate beyond expectation, a phenomenon documented in modern tests, yet difficult to fully explain because the chamber's shape does not cleanly match known resonant geometries, raising questions about whether the effect was an intentional feature of ritual practice or a fortunate accident subsequently woven into the site's social meaning, and, in either case, the amplified hum suggests that sound once played a role here, shaping the experience of those who moved through its dim passages. Nearby, the decorated room presents a level of craftsmanship that contrasts with the rougher niches above, its surfaces worked into rhythmic indentations, reminiscent of architectural motifs found in the island's freestanding temples, though their purpose underground remains elusive, for no tools survive to clarify the methods used, and no inscriptions offer directives, leaving archaeologists to piece together interpretations from fragmentary clues, such as scattered human remains, beads of shell and stone, and traces of pigment whose origin cannot always be securely identified, creating a patchwork of evidence that hints at funerary customs, transitional rites, or perhaps communal gatherings responding to the shifting obligations of a prehistoric island society. And yet, contradictions appear amid these readings, for the Hypogeum's spatial organization seems too complex for a site used solely as a necropolis, its passageways branching in ways that suggest controlled access, its chambers arranged with an attention to flow rather than simple storage, and its expansions carried out across phases that indicate evolving priorities, as though generations returned not merely to enter the dead, but to engage with a place already imbued with significance, adapting it to new practices even as its original intentions faded from collective memory. The discovery of small carved figurines, including the reclining, sleeping lady, deepens the puzzle by offering glimpses of a symbolic world difficult to parse. For while the figure is often associated with dreams, death, or regeneration, its context within the Hypogeum raises additional possibilities, such as the representation of a revered ancestor, a guardian of transitional states, or an embodiment of the island's broader ritual landscape, Yet none of these hypotheses resolve fully with the stratigraphy of the chambers, where certain levels show signs of intense use, while others suggest periods of abandonment or repurposing without clear cause. Geological examinations reveal that the limestone layers here vary in density and fossil content, factors that may have influenced the choice of where to carve particular rooms. And in places, the stone reveals natural fissures that seem to have guided the extension of certain passages, prompting speculation that the earliest builders may have been responding to pre-existing cracks or natural cavities that are now obscured by later modifications. And such hints encourage a broader view in which the Hypogeum represents not a sudden undertaking, but a long dialogue with the subterranean landscape, evolving as the community's relationship with the earth deepened, faded, or changed direction. Still, the absence of definitive evidence allows alternative readings to persist, including the notion that some rooms served as auditory chambers for rites involving chanting or percussion, or that the lower levels' labyrinthine quality served to restrict access to those versed in a particular cosmology, with turns designed to disorient, soften light, or prepare individuals for encounters with spaces regarded as thresholds between worlds, interpretations that remain cautious yet difficult to dismiss given the site's sensory qualities. And when considering the full structure, its irregular yet purposeful geometry, its mix of rough and refined spaces, its combinations of burial remains and architectural sophistication, researchers often conclude that the Hypogeum may reflect a convergence of functions, a repository of ancestors, a locus of ritual, and a symbolic descent into the island's deeper geological memory, each layer shaped by the hands of people whose intentions can only be glimpsed through the material echoes they left behind. And as one emerges once more into daylight after tracing the downward turns of the site, the impressions of shadow, sound, and carved stone linger with an understated suggestion that the Hypogeum's most compelling qualities lie not in hidden chambers or undiscovered artifacts, but in the way its quiet architecture sustains an unresolved dialogue between human purpose and geological time, leaving the sense that something essential about its origins remains just beneath the surface of understanding, waiting in the dim contour of its carved walls for the next careful attempt to interpret their meaning. Longyou Caves. Hidden beneath the rolling landscape of Zhejiang, the Longyou Caves open into vast chambers whose sheer scale and mathematical precision feel unexpectedly deliberate, beginning with quiet descents where the first impressions are of monumental emptiness rather than ornament, the walls rising in near vertical planes covered in parallel chisel marks that run with such consistent rhythm they create the impression of a single continuous gesture frozen across stone. And as the eye adjusts to the dimness, the immense dimensions resolve. Aisles as tall as multi-story buildings, pillars placed with careful spacing, ceilings carved into broad planes, interrupted by sweeping arcs that seem to follow an internal logic, yet resist simple classification as engineering, for the caves lack any surviving tools, debris, or inscriptions that might anchor them to a known historical moment. And although the current understanding ties their excavation to the late Warring States or early Han period, the absence of clear evidence leaves room for measured uncertainty. For the caves present neither the typical mining traces nor the architectural cues of ritual spaces, instead emerging as hybrid interiors whose purpose must be inferred from form alone. And this form reveals halls that mirror one another in scale but differ subtly in geometry, as though multiple teams worked from a shared plan, but introduced local adaptations responding to the stone's texture, water seepage, or structural needs, creating variations that complicate any assumption of central coordination. Geological surveys show that the soft sandstone of the region lends itself to large-scale excavation, yet the cave's survival over 2 millennia suggests an understanding of load distribution that goes beyond trial and error, for the thick pillars and carefully angled ceilings distribute pressure with unexpected sophistication, raising questions about whether their builders possessed empirical knowledge accumulated over generations, or whether they drew inspiration from now lost architectural traditions. The cave's internal surfaces, marked by the repeated herringbone-like striations, are often interpreted as the result of quarrying techniques. Yet the aesthetic regularity of these marks has prompted speculation that their pattern may have held symbolic or practical significance, perhaps aiding in acoustics, drainage, or even internal illumination, though none of these hypotheses resolves fully when tested against the varied chambers, some of which show slight deviations in the angle and depth of the grooves as though the workers shifted technique in response to unseen constraints. Small ledges, platforms, and recesses appear irregularly along the walls, their placements not always symmetrical or functionally obvious, suggesting either incomplete work, adaptations to natural inclusions in the stone, or the remains of features now lost, such as wooden structures or water management systems, that might have once occupied the interiors, and yet no residues or fastening points provide definitive clues, leaving archaeologists to weigh competing interpretations without clear resolution. One cave contains pools of still water that reflect the ceiling. In such perfect clarity they appear like inverted chambers, and these mirrors of stone and shadow contribute to the broader sense that the caves were never solely utilitarian, though their lack of explicit ceremonial markers challenges arguments for a purely ritualistic purpose. And the hydrological stability of these pools further complicates the picture, for their longevity implies an understanding of groundwater dynamics uncommon in simple quarry operations. Local legends describe the caves as the work of supernatural beings or forgotten dynastic efforts, but while such stories preserve cultural memory, they cannot substitute for stratigraphic evidence, which remains sparse due to centuries of water flow, human reuse, and the absence of datable materials. And this scarcity has encouraged some researchers to consider whether the caves might have been intentionally cleared of tools and debris before abandonment, hinting at an organized conclusion to their use rather than sudden desertion. Contradictions arise when comparing the cave's refined interiors with the surrounding region's known historical architecture. For aside from large earthen structures and tomb complexes, there are few parallels to excavations on this scale, leading to debates over whether the caves were part of a larger infrastructural network, perhaps connected by now-collapsed passages or above-ground wooden complexes that left no trace, or whether they represent isolated undertakings whose motivations have not survived in written records. The uniformity of the chisel. Marks throughout most chambers has prompted analyses attempting to determine the direction and speed of the work, revealing patterns that suggest coordinated teams working in downward sequences. Yet, even this reconstruction leaves unanswered why such effort was invested in spaces that show no clear evidence of habitation, storage, or military use. And as such, the caves occupy a liminal space in archaeological interpretation, their scale demanding explanation, while their emptiness resists simple narratives. And while some propose they served as quarries whose stone was removed for large construction projects, the lack of corresponding monumental structures in nearby regions creates tension with this view, especially since the interior planning does not match typical quarry logic, where efficiency rather than symmetry governs extraction. Faced with these uncertainties, researchers often return to the caves themselves, studying subtle disruptions in wall patterns, patches of discoloration, and variations in ceiling thickness that hint at natural fissures or ancient collapses now stabilized by human intervention, suggesting a dynamic relationship between excavation and geological reality. Yet even this interplay does not fully illuminate why the caves were shaped with such care. And in the end, the Longyou Caves persist as spaces where human intention and geological constraint meet in a dialogue rendered mute by the passage of time, for their vast halls offer no inscriptions, no narrative reliefs, and no clear spatial hierarchies, only the rhythmic texture of chisel marks and the quiet arrangement of pillars holding their weight in steady patience, leaving those who enter with the impression that the true story of the caves may lie not in hidden chambers or unexcavated recesses, but in the unresolved question of why such monumental effort was invested in a complex whose purpose remains suspended between practicality and abstraction, its meaning resting in the lingering silence that fills its stone geometry, inviting but never quite yielding to interpretation. Ellora Caves. Carved into the volcanic basalt cliffs of Maharashtra, the Ellora Caves unfold along a winding escarpment, where religious devotion, shifting political climates, and the stubborn materiality of rock converge into a single architectural continuum, that begins with modest excavations and gradually crescendos into vast complexes whose scale suggests not sudden inspiration, but a patient sequence of decisions unfolding over centuries. And as one moves from the early Buddhist viharas with their measured rows of cells and pillared halls into the later Hindu and Jain monuments, the stone seems to respond to evolving intentions, its surfaces transitioning from restrained austerity to elaborate sculptural programs that cover walls, ceilings, and freestanding columns in narratives wrought with such precision that they appear almost woven into the rock rather than carved from it, creating an environment where craftsmanship feels inseparable from geology. At first glance, the layout appears linear, yet subtle shifts in orientation, variations in depth, and inconsistencies in carving technique reveal a more complex story in which different traditions worked simultaneously or in overlapping phases, sometimes reconfiguring earlier designs, sometimes introducing unexpected architectural experiments, and this interleaving of religious expressions, Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain, embodies a cultural landscape more fluid than the clear divisions suggested by later textual traditions. A landscape where artisans and patrons navigated shared spaces with a mixture of collaboration, adaptation, and pragmatic coexistence, leaving inscriptions sparse and intentions only partially discernible from the stone. Among these excavations, the Kailasa temple stands as the most arresting anomaly. Its massive courtyard, columned galleries, and towering central shrine carved downward from a single block of rock, with such precision that the negative space itself becomes a kind of monumental sculpture, suggesting an engineering logic that required not only an understanding of load-bearing and drainage, but also an intuitive grasp of how to choreograph the removal of thousands of tons of basalt without compromising the final design. Yet despite its imposing clarity, contradictions emerge when examining the tool marks, unfinished surfaces, and uneven depths hidden in peripheral corridors, signs that the execution involved multiple teams working concurrently, adapting to unexpected fissures or collapses, and at times altering the plan in ways that remain undetectable to casual observation. The cave's reliefs, depicting episodes from mythic cycles, appear meticulously planned, yet close analysis reveals reworked figures, shifted compositions, and abandoned niches whose asymmetry hints at either evolving ritual requirements or the improvisations of artisans responding to the quirks of the stone. And this interplay between intention and constraint becomes even more apparent in the surrounding caves, where the contours of natural fractures guided the placement of pillars and the sequencing of chambers, creating subtle irregularities that complicate any assumption of strict architectural order. Geological studies show that the basalt flows here vary considerably in hardness, with softer horizons alternating with more resistant layers, a pattern that likely influenced both the location and the depth of certain excavations. And in places where the stone proved unexpectedly brittle, one sees evidence of reinforcement, pillars thicker than their counterparts, ceilings carved with relieving arches, or niches left unadorned, details that reflect an ongoing negotiation between artistic ambition and structural necessity. Yet for all this practical adaptation, the symbolic programs embedded within the caves introduce layers of meaning that resist definitive interpretation. For the juxtaposition of Buddhist Chaitya halls with Hindu shrines and Jain monasteries evokes a social dynamic in which multiple communities engaged in parallel acts of monumental expression, though the degree of interaction between them remains uncertain, and the absence of explicit historical records leaves room for hypotheses ranging from royal patronage that encouraged pluralistic expression to more decentralized processes in which local guilds worked according to shifting patterns of support and competition. Some scholars argue that the caves reflect a period of deliberate religious harmony, while others propose that their coexistence may have been less about ideological unity and more about practical accommodation within a landscape already marked by earlier excavations. Yet archaeological evidence offers only partial answers, for while certain inscriptions link caves to specific rulers, many of the grandest structures remain unclaimed, their creators known only through the traces of their tools and the patterns of their labor. Even the sequence of construction remains debated, with stylistic analyses suggesting overlapping periods rather than a neat chronological progression. And the presence of unfinished caves complicates the picture further, raising questions about whether work ceased due to political instability, exhausted patronage, or geological challenges that rendered some chambers unsuitable for completion. In the Jain Caves at the northern end, the shift toward more delicate ornamentation and finely articulated pillars indicates yet another phase of adaptation, as artisans explored the limits of the basalt's capacity for intricate carving, pushing the material into forms that seem almost weightless compared to the massive monolith of Kailasa. And this contrast underscores the elasticity of Ellora's architectural imagination, which ranged from the monumental to the miniature within a single cliff face. Walking the length of the complex reveals layers of sound and silence shaped by its architecture, echoes in the chaitya halls that amplify even the softest footfall, muted chambers where sound disappears into porous stone, and shaded courtyards where wind patterns hint at the open sky while remaining framed by rock, creating sensory ambiguities that suggest the caves were designed not only for visual experience, but for acoustic and atmospheric ones as well. And as the path traces the cliff's curvature, the cumulative impression is of a landscape shaped by centuries-long dialogue between human intention and basaltic mass, where each carving decision carried geological implications, and each geological constraint inspired new forms of expression, resulting in a complex whose unity lies not in a single purpose, but in the persistent human impulse to transform stone into a record of belief, memory, and craft. Yet, despite scholarly advances, much about Ellora remains uncertain, not in a dramatic sense of hidden chambers or lost civilizations, but in the quieter recognition that the motivations, sequences, and lived experiences behind its monumental forms are only partially recoverable, leaving the caves suspended between the clarity of their carved surfaces and the opacity of the histories they embody. Their long colonnades and shadowed halls offering a measured reminder that even in sites thoroughly mapped and studied, the deepest aspects of ancient architectural intent may continue to reside just beyond the reach of full understanding. Ajanta Caves. Carved into a serpent-shaped bend of the Wakora River, the Ajanta Caves emerge from a basalt cliff in a long arc where shifting light, seasonal rains, and the ancient rhythms of monastic life once converged into a landscape that feels both sheltered and exposed, beginning with early excavation phases in which modest viharas, arranged around square halls with simple cells, suggest a community seeking contemplative refuge rather than grand expression. Their ceilings marked by unobtrusive toolwork and their facades displaying restrained ornamentation that hints at architectural tendencies still in formation. And as one moves along the curve of the cliff, the caves gradually shift in scope and ambition. The later Mahayana phases introducing elaborate chaitya halls with soaring vaulted ceilings, carved to resemble wooden prototypes, their ribbed surfaces catching angled shadows that soften the stone into quiet mimicry of organic form, while intricately sculpted facades adorned with guardians, musicians, and celestial figures unfold in rhythms that seem to echo the flow of the river below. Inside, the celebrated murals, still vibrant despite centuries of monsoon weathering and human presence, create atmospheres where narrative, ritual, and artistic experimentation intersect. The pigments layered in subtle gradations that preserve courtly scenes, didactic tales, and symbolic gestures rendered with such delicacy that they read almost like suspended motion, though their preservation is uneven with flaked surfaces, soot-darkened patches, and repair attempts from different eras, all contributing to an interpretive puzzle that scholars continue to parse as they trace stylistic changes across the site. Contradictions emerge in the organization of the caves, for while the general sequence appears chronological, the coexistence of older Hinayana Chaityas alongside newer Mahayana Viharas reveals a landscape not of straightforward religious transition, but of overlapping practices, where older spaces were maintained or repurposed even as new architectural programs took shape, and such interactions complicate earlier narratives of abrupt doctrinal shifts, suggesting instead a more nuanced interplay in which artisans, donors, and monastic communities negotiated continuity and innovation within the confines of the cliff. Inscriptions attribute certain caves to specific patrons, royal figures, merchants, and local elites, Yet many of the grander spaces remain anonymous, their sponsorship obscured by time, and toolmark analyses indicate multiple guilds working simultaneously or sequentially, sometimes following coherent plans and sometimes adapting to unexpected geological conditions, such as variations in basalt, hardness, hidden fissures, or pockets of softer material that forced redesigns, abandoned niches, or reinforced pillars whose asymmetry becomes visible only upon close inspection. In Cave 19, the elaborately carved chaitya facade presents a level of detail that contrasts with the simpler interior surfaces, raising questions about whether its exterior served a specific ritual or social function distinct from the meditative purposes of its hall, while in Cave 26, the monumental reclining Buddha and surrounding sculptural program suggest a complex negotiation between narrative storytelling and architectural framing, for the reliefs seem designed to guide movement and focus, yet include reworked figures and shifted compositions that imply ongoing adjustments during carving, either refinements of initial plans or responses to unexpected structural limitations. The murals themselves reveal layers of artistic decision-making as underdrawings occasionally emerge beneath flaked pigments, showing alterations in composition and changes in gesture or orientation that hint at a dynamic creative process rather than strict adherence to a singular blueprint. And their pigments, derived from local minerals, plant sources, and rare imports, attest to a network of materials extending beyond the immediate region, though the precise trade routes and workshop practices remain only partially understood. Environmental studies show that the cave's microclimate, once stabilized by the overhanging cliff, has shifted over centuries due to changes in vegetation, river flow, and even human visitation patterns, creating subtle alterations in humidity that affect mural preservation and offer clues about how ancient monks may have managed airflow and lighting using lamps, reflectors, and perhaps wooden screens now lost to decay, leaving behind only soot residues and faint discolorations on ceilings that suggest the rhythm of illumination during ritual or daily activity. The alignment of certain caves with seasonal light patterns has inspired hypotheses that the placement of entrances or windows responded to solstitial or equinoctial considerations, though such interpretations remain tentative, supported by circumstantial alignments rather than explicit evidence, and the cliff's natural curvature complicates these theories, for some orientations may result from geological constraints rather than deliberate solar alignment. Elsewhere, incomplete caves present further enigmas. Rough chambers with partially carved pillars, abandoned facade outlines, or sudden shifts in carving style that could reflect halted patronage, political upheavals, or geological instability. But in the absence of written explanations, they remain open to multiple readings, serving as silent records of intentions that never reached completion. And through all these layers, architectural, artistic, geological, the Ajanta complex demonstrates a long continuity of monastic presence, yet its eventual decline and centuries-long burial beneath vegetation introduce a final mystery. For when rediscovered in the 19th century, the caves had been partly reclaimed by the cliff itself, their entrances obscured by soil and roots, as though time had attempted to fold them back into the landscape, and this partial concealment may have protected many of the murals while simultaneously erasing clues about their final centuries of use. Walking the sequence of caves today, one senses not only the technical mastery of their creators, but also the evolving intentions that guided their formation, from secluded monastic retreat to elaborately articulated devotional complex, each chamber bearing traces of adaptation to shifting beliefs, patronage networks, and geological realities, yet none offering a definitive account of how these forces intertwined. And, as the path eventually returns to the forested slopes above the cliff, the lingering impression is that Ajanta's significance lies as much in its unresolved layers as in its celebrated artistry, for its murals and halls preserve a dialogue between aspiration and constraint, memory and erosion, leaving the sense that, even within a site meticulously studied and restored, the deeper motivations that shaped its long arc of creation remain suspended in the quiet recesses of its carved shadows, just beyond the reach of complete historical certainty. Derinkuyu. Beneath the quiet plains of Cappadocia, Derinkuyu descends through volcanic tuff in sequential layers that seem to blur the boundary between deliberate engineering and the slow geological rhythms that shape the soft stone long before human hands began carving it. Starting with upper levels where broad chambers, storage rooms, and stable-like recesses suggest an early phase of habitation or refuge, their simple geometry and straightforward ventilation shafts hinting at practical concerns rather than grand design. Yet even here, small irregularities, unexpected alcoves, corridors that narrow without clear reason, and stairs that turn at slightly uneven angles imply a construction process responsive to the stone's shifting density, as though each expansion required moment-by-moment adaptation rather than adherence to a single predetermined plan. Deeper levels introduce tighter passageways and interconnected rooms arranged in patterns that seem at once cautious and intentional, for the vertical shafts that carry air throughout the complex operate with a consistency that belies the apparent disorder of the tunnels, suggesting that the builders, whether in isolated phases or across generations, possessed an empirical understanding of airflow that allowed them to maintain breathable conditions even as they carved downward through multiple stories, though the precise methods by which they tested and maintained ventilation remain speculative in the absence of written records. Rolling stone doors, circular monoliths positioned to seal off key junctions, appear at strategic points, their weight and placement hinting not at continuous occupation, but at episodic use during periods of threat. Yet their distribution is uneven, with some levels heavily fortified and others left open, raising questions about whether certain areas were designed for temporary refuge, long-term settlement, or specialized tasks whose purposes have been obscured by time. In some chambers, soot residues and small hearth depressions suggest domestic activity, while adjacent rooms show no such traces, creating a mosaic of uses that defies simple categorization as either a permanent underground city or an emergency shelter. And the absence of extensive organic deposits complicates efforts to determine how many people once occupied the space, or for how long, or whether its role shifted repeatedly across centuries of regional conflict, migration, or climatic instability. The deeper one goes, the more the architecture departs from purely functional logic, as narrow corridors suddenly widen into meeting rooms, or intersect with staircases that descend toward levels where water wells, communal areas, and storage cells form a network so extensive it feels less like a single project than the cumulative result of many small decisions made across time, with each generation adding or modifying rooms according to needs no longer fully recoverable, yet still legible in the shifting textures of tool marks that trace different eras of workmanship. Geological analyses reveal that the tuff varies substantially in hardness, the softer layers facilitating excavation, while the harder bands required adjustments to room placement and ceiling angles, and these constraints appear in unexpected offsets where chambers do not align vertically, or where staircases veer sideways to avoid resistant stone, producing spatial irregularities that, while practical, create an overall layout that feels labyrinthine, even though many passages ultimately reconnect with the main circulation routes. Contradictions emerge when comparing Derinkuyu to nearby underground complexes, for while some share similar features, ventilation shafts, storage areas, defensive doors, others exhibit organizational schemes that differ markedly, suggesting that the region's subterranean architecture grew not from a single cultural blueprint, but from a more fluid tradition of adapting the landscape for refuge, storage, or seasonal habitation, with individual communities developing their own patterns of excavation based on local needs and geological circumstances. Yet, Derinkuyu's depth, reaching roughly 18 stories, distinguishes it within this broader pattern and its lower levels, where the air grows stiller and the ceilings press nearer to the floor, contain spaces whose functions remain uncertain. Long corridors terminating in featureless dead ends, small annexes without ventilation, and chambers whose shapes resist comparison to known, domestic or industrial forms, prompting cautious hypotheses about storage, temporary confinement, or ritual activity, though none of these interpretations aligns neatly with the available evidence. Analyses of the ventilation system suggest that it may have been extended downward, in phases rather than planned from the outset, with early shafts later repurposed or expanded as new levels were carved, a process that would have required careful calibration to maintain airflow. Yet the builders left no inscriptions or markers to indicate how these adjustments were coordinated, leaving modern researchers to infer solutions from structural clues, such as the distribution of soot and the pattern of debris deposits near older shaft openings. Water management offers another puzzle, for the wells appear to be connected to aquifers that supplied both surface and underground communities. Yet the complex relationship between the underground channels and surface access points has not been fully reconstructed, raising questions about how water was controlled to prevent contamination or overuse during extended underground occupation, and whether the wells were original features or later additions to accommodate growing populations. The scale of Derinkuyu has inspired theories that range from simple refuge use to more elaborate interpretations involving long-term habitation during sieges or environmental crises. But archaeological evidence remains inconclusive, for while the infrastructure could support large numbers of people, the lack of extensive refuse layers or permanent fixtures suggests patterns of occupancy that were intermittent rather than continuous, perhaps aligning with cycles of conflict or seasonal movement rather than a single defining event. And as researchers map the tunnels with modern tools, they find blocked passages, collapsed sections, and partially filled corridors that hint at extensions now inaccessible, raising the possibility that the known complex is only part of a larger network once connected to neighboring underground settlements, though the nature of these connections, formal, occasional, or simply geological coincidence, remains unresolved. Emerging from the lower levels, where silence seems to thicken with the weight of centuries, one senses that Derinkuyu's significance lies not only in its engineering achievements or its capacity for refuge, but in the layered history of adaptation etched into its walls, each chamber reflecting choices made under conditions we can only approximate. And as the final stairway returns to the open air, the contrast between the sunlit plain and the deep branching architecture below reinforces the impression that the complex represents an ongoing dialogue between human necessity and geological possibility, its purpose shaped by circumstances now blurred, leaving its full story suspended within the quiet geometry of its descending corridors, unresolved yet enduring in the depths beneath the earth. Catacombs of Paris. Beneath the orderly boulevards and quiet courtyards of Paris, the catacombs extend through a network of former limestone quarries whose origins long predate the city above. Beginning as a patchwork of medieval and early modern extraction sites carved to supply building stone for churches, bridges, and fortifications, their rough pillars and uneven ceilings shaped more by geological necessity than architectural intention, and only centuries later repurposed into the vast ossuary that now winds through dim corridors where the past accumulates in layers of bone and shadow. The transformation from quarry to repository unfolded gradually, prompted by collapsing ground, overcrowded cemeteries, and shifting urban priorities. And as engineers mapped the labyrinth beneath the city, they encountered incoherent passages, abandoned shafts, and flooded chambers that bore the imprint of earlier miners who carved according to the unpredictable contours of Lutetian limestone, leaving behind a fractured landscape that required consolidation before it could receive the remains of millions. Early stabilization efforts introduced masonry walls, reinforced pillars, and carved inscriptions marking dates and project leaders. Yet these interventions sit alongside untouched stretches of quarry where pick scars remain visible, their rhythmic patterns interrupted only by natural fissures or pockets of softer stone, creating a dialogue between purposeful engineering and the inherited geometry of extraction that persisted long after the miners left. When the ossuary was established in the late 18th century, bones were transferred from overfilled churchyards and arranged with measured formality. Skulls and femurs stacked in alternating courses, decorative patterns shaping macabre facades that mask the loose piles behind them. Yet even these carefully arranged displays contain inconsistencies, with some sections meticulously ordered and others more haphazard, reflecting variations in workforce, time constraints, and perhaps differing attitudes toward the remains themselves. and this juxtaposition contributes to the site's layered character, where order and disorder coexist in quiet equilibrium. In certain galleries, inscriptions offer morsels of reflection, quotations, dates, and moral reminders, yet their placement is irregular, leaving stretches of corridor without commentary, as though the curator's intentions were themselves shaped by the unpredictable architecture of the quarries, which curve, narrow, and shift in elevation in ways that resist a fully unified design. Deeper within, older quarry features linger, carved signatures from 18th century inspectors, survey marks denoting structural concerns, and remnants of support systems once used to prevent collapses in unstable zones, while occasional damp chambers reveal natural seepage paths that have slowly reshaped the limestone, creating mineral deposits that blur the boundaries between human excavation and geological process. Contradictions appear when comparing maps from different periods, for the catacombs have been redrawn countless times as passages were closed, reinforced, or rerouted, and the shifting cartography reflects a subterranean landscape in perpetual negotiation with the city above, where construction, transportation, and groundwater management continually alter the stability of the terrain, prompting new interventions that sometimes obscure earlier configurations and leave researchers reconstructing lost connections from fragmentary records. Aside from the public ossuary, vast stretches of the network remain restricted, their tunnels maintaining the character of raw quarries marked by irregular pillars and sudden drops. And within these zones, unexpected features appear. Carved benches, makeshift chapels, and stone-cut basins whose purposes remain uncertain, perhaps created by quarry workers for rest or ritual, or by later visitors who repurposed abandoned chambers into informal gathering places, though the absence of contextual artifacts leaves these interpretations tentative. Geological studies reveal that the limestone layers here formed in ancient marine environments, their fossil-rich textures still visible in certain walls where excavation exposed bedding planes and subtle variations in sedimentation, and these geological features influence the quarry layout, with miners following the most workable strata, and leaving behind irregularities where harder layers force deviations in passage direction, creating a labyrinth shaped by both resource extraction and the stubborn complexity of the subterranean bedrock. The ossuary itself, though often viewed as a single entity, encompasses multiple phases of reorganization, with bones moved, restacked, or reclassified by successive custodians who impose their own sense of order on the remains, resulting in subtle differences in stacking technique and corridor composition that testify to changing priorities over time. Yet these differences are rarely visible without careful comparison, underscoring how much of the site's history lies in details that escape casual observation. And beneath these layers of engineering, geology, and human intervention lies the quiet enigma of why certain sections feel more finished than others, why some passages were chosen for ornamentation, while others were left raw, and whether the decisions reflected practical constraints, symbolic intentions, or the cumulative effects of centuries of maintenance responding to shifting needs. Walking through the long corridors where skulls stare outward from their ordered rows, one senses not a singular narrative, but an accumulation of incomplete stories shaped by urban growth, mortality, and the evolving relationship between the city and its underworld, each chamber bearing traces of choices made under circumstances both documented and forgotten. And as the path eventually rises toward daylight, the transition from stone-lined darkness to the structured radiance of the modern city underscores the unresolved tension between the order imposed on the catacombs and the inherent irregularity of their geological origins, leaving the impression that the site's deepest mystery lies not in hidden chambers or undiscovered bones, but in the subtle interplay between human intention and the enduring complexity of the subterranean landscape that continues to shape and be shaped by the city above, Moaning Caverns. Hidden within the rolling foothills of the Sierra Nevada, Moaning Caverns descends through limestone, shaped by ancient marine sediments and slow geological dissolution, its entrance a narrow shaft that opens into a vast vertical chamber whose proportions feel more like a natural cathedral than a typical cave. the walls rising in fluid contours that bear the signature of water's long retreat, their surfaces smoothed into pale whorls and faint ribs that track the downward flow of mineral-rich currents over tens of thousands of years, inviting the impression that the chamber was not so much formed as coaxed into being by persistent, unseen forces. The first descent reveals a quiet interplay of moisture and echo, for small droplets fall intermittently from high ledges to strike the stone below, generating the soft, resonant tones that gave the cavern its name. And though these sounds fluctuate with humidity, temperature shifts, and seasonal groundwater movement, the early discoverers often interpreted them as if the earth itself were breathing, an atmospheric effect that lingers in the cave's reputation even as geological explanations provide a more grounded understanding. Deeper within, the walls reveal subtle bands of color, oxidized iron, manganese staining, calcite veils, that trace environmental variations across millennia, and these layers, when viewed in sequence, form a partial archive of climatic shifts, whose wider implications reach far beyond the cavern, though the record is fragmentary and often blurred by subsequent mineral deposition, leaving researchers to piece together patterns through cautious sampling rather than continuous readings. Scattered across ledges and crevices, ancient bone deposits add a human dimension to the cave's story. Yet even here clarity remains elusive, for some remains belong to individuals who fell or became trapped in pre-contact eras, while others are animal bones washed in during floods or dropped by predators utilizing the entrance as a natural trap, producing a mixture that complicates efforts to distinguish intentional human presence from accidental deposition. And this ambiguity is heightened by the absence of clear artifacts that might reveal deliberate use, habitation, or ritual activity. Early excavations in the 20th century unearthed one particularly well-preserved human skeleton, whose position suggested a fall down the vertical shaft. And while popular narratives transformed this discovery into tales of prehistoric tragedy or ceremonial descent, archaeological interpretations remain more cautious, noting the lack of contextual evidence that would support either theory conclusively, and the cave's vertical geometry makes accidental entry far more plausible than intentional exploration in ancient times. Yet certain aspects of the cavern's layout raise quieter questions, for the upper shaft gives way to branching passageways, whose contours vary from smooth and gently sloping to jagged and abrupt, reflecting the different rates at which water dissolved bedding plains and exploited fractures in the limestone. And in some recesses, the stone forms curious bulbous protrusions or hollowed alcoves that seem to evoke architectural niches, even though they result purely from the interplay of chemical erosion and capillary flow, offering shapes that invite interpretation, while resisting any clear narrative beyond natural process. The cavern's immense main chamber presents another puzzle. Its height and width suggest prolonged vertical dissolution, where water once cascaded in substantial volume. Yet the modern hydrology of the region shows no such major streams nearby, implying that the cave formed under environmental conditions quite different from those seen today. Conditions that may have included higher groundwater tables, more intense seasonal flooding, or prolonged periods of saturation that have since diminished, leaving the chamber as a remnant of an earlier landscape whose precise parameters remain uncertain. Speleothems, stalactites, flowstone draperies, and column-like formations appear sparsely compared to other limestone caves in the region, an uneven distribution that has led to hypotheses about airflow patterns, mineral availability, or temporal fluctuations in dripping water, yet none of these explanations fully accounts for why certain surfaces remain bare, while adjacent areas are coated in thick calcite deposits, and the patchiness suggests a microclimate once more variable than modern measurements reveal, perhaps influenced by now sealed openings or structural shifts caused by seismic events common to the Sierra foothills. In the lower chambers, tighter passages reveal cross-sections of ancient sediment fill that was later eroded out, leaving behind small terraces and scalloped walls whose markings align with the directional flow of subterranean water. And these traces allow geologists to reconstruct parts of the cave's developmental sequence, though the overall timeline remains only partially resolved due to the complex overlaps between dissolution, collapse, and mineral deposition. Each layer of evidence overprinting the previous one in ways that obscure precise dating. Modern mapping technologies have identified minor offshoots that extend beyond the publicly accessible areas, and while none appear to rival the main chamber in scale, they hint at a broader network shaped by the same long processes, with some passages narrowing into fissures that suggest further dissolution potential or sealed cavities beyond reach, though current surveys conclude that most significant voids have already been exposed. Still, the cave's acoustics continue to provoke fascination, for the moaning sounds fluctuate in ways not fully captured by simple airflow models, sometimes intensifying in dry months when one might expect reduced resonance, at other times fading even when dripping increases, pointing toward a subtle combination of air pressure changes, temperature inversions within the shaft, and the shifting resonance of water films on distant walls, producing a phenomenon that, while scientifically explicable, retains an elusive quality in practice. And as visitors descend spiral stairways or rappel into the main chamber, the sense of entering a place shaped almost entirely by natural forces contrasts with scattered signs of human intervention, metal steps, anchored platforms, and archaeological markers. Yet these modifications do little to diminish the impression that the cave's vastness is inseparable from deeper geological rhythms that both reveal and conceal the past, offering glimpses of ancient human encounters without confirming a larger narrative. Rising back toward the surface, where daylight replaces the muted glow of lamps and the cave's quiet resonance gradually dissipates, one carries an impression shaped less by singular discoveries than by the cumulative interplay of stone, water, and time, a sense that Moaning Caverns holds neither dramatic secrets nor fully decipherable histories, but instead preserves the subtler mystery of a landscape formed under conditions now partially lost. Its vertical chamber, a lingering reminder of forces that once shaped the region with slow, unrecorded persistence, leaving behind a space where natural acoustics and geological memory intersect in ways that remain just beyond complete explanation. Cappadocia's underground labyrinths. Spread across the soft volcanic tuff of central Anatolia, Cappadocia's underground labyrinths extend beneath a landscape already marked by surreal pinnacles, eroded valleys, and rock-cut dwellings, forming a hidden counterpart to the region's surface architecture, where communities carve deeply into the earth, not as a single unified project, but as a long, incremental response to shifting needs, geological opportunities, and historical pressures, beginning with modest storage rooms and shallow refugees that later expanded into multi-level complexes whose passages weave through the subsurface with an organic irregularity, shaped by both human intent and the unpredictable textures of the stone. Unlike the more concentrated depth of Derinkuyu, the labyrinths of Cappadocia spread laterally as much as they descend, their networks branching outward to create clusters of chambers linked by narrow stairways, slotted doorways, and angled corridors that adapt to the layered tuff, which varies noticeably in hardness and moisture retention, prompting excavators to shift direction when encountering resistant bands or unstable pockets that required reinforcement or abandonment, a process evident in truncated passages, half-formed rooms, and abrupt changes in ceiling height that preserve the record of decisions made in response to the stone itself. Above ground, the region's cave churches, pigeon lofts, and carved dwellings hint at a long tradition of working with the tuff. But the subterranean spaces exhibit a distinct logic, with ventilation shafts, concealed entrances, and rolling stone doors that suggest episodic use during times of conflict, though the distribution of these defensive features varies from site to site, supporting the idea that each community developed its own strategies rather than conforming to a regional template. And this autonomy complicates efforts to classify the labyrinths according to fixed categories such as permanent settlements, monastic retreats, or emergency shelters. In many complexes, simple domestic features, fire-blackened niches, grain bins, wine presses, appear alongside storage silos large enough to support extended habitation. Yet the absence of robust refuse layers implies that occupancy may have been intermittent, with groups retreating underground temporarily during periods of unrest or climatic extremes. leaving only minimal material traces of their presence. Certain corridors connect multiple complexes or appear to converge towards central communication routes, though whether these connections reflect planned coordination between communities or the gradual merging of excavations over generations remains uncertain, as geological voids, collapsed tunnels, and erosional losses have obscured the original extent of the networks. The presence of chapels carved into some subterranean spaces introduces another layer of interpretation for their simple altars. Crosses incised into walls and occasional apses suggest ritual activity. Yet the modesty of these features contrasts with the richly decorated rock-cut churches above ground, implying either different functions or limited time for embellishment. And the ambiguous relationship between the two architectural traditions has led scholars to debate whether the underground chapels served mainly as temporary refuges for monastic communities or as communal sacred spaces used during specific periods of displacement. Geological analyses reveal that many of the labyrinths exploit natural weaknesses, vertical fractures, bedding planes, and zones of softer material, using these lines of least resistance to guide excavation, a strategy that produced meandering passageways whose shapes seem labyrinthine, not by intentional design, but by the necessity of following the stone's internal structure. And this merging of natural and human geometries complicates modern mapping efforts, as some early surveyors mistook natural voids for unfinished chambers and human-cut expansions for natural fissures. Contradictions arise when comparing historical accounts with archaeological evidence. For medieval chroniclers describe large populations taking refuge underground, yet the absence of extensive domestic debris suggests that these events, if they occurred, were short-lived or involved only certain areas of the complexes. And while oral traditions speak of tunnels stretching for miles between towns, modern surveys often encounter collapsed sections or geological barriers that limit the continuity of these routes, leaving open the question of whether the networks were ever as integrated as later narratives suggest. Water management adds another layer of complexity, as some labyrinths include wells that tap into local aquifers, while others lack such features entirely, implying variable durations of intended use or reliance on stored supplies. Yet the relationship between these subterranean wells and surface water systems is imperfectly understood due to sediment infill and modern alterations that obscure their original depth and function. Certain lower rooms exhibit smooth, rounded walls consistent with long-term air and moisture circulation, rather than intensive human activity, suggesting that natural processes may have modified or even enlarged some chambers after their initial excavation, blurring the distinction between original form and later transformation. And in a few cases, mineral crusts partially obscure tool marks, complicating efforts to determine the exact sequence of carving and subsequent environmental change. Mapping the labyrinths with modern technology reveals a patchwork of interconnected and isolated spaces, some extending beneath present-day villages, while others lie abandoned in remote valleys. And this variability reflects the long temporal span of their creation, from early periods when basic shelters sufficed to later eras when communities expanded and adapted existing networks in response to political change, invasions, or shifts in settlement patterns. Yet, despite growing precision in understanding their construction techniques, the motivations behind the labyrinths remain only partially recoverable, for they represent neither a single architectural tradition nor a uniform social response, but rather a flexible adaptation to a landscape where soft stone offered both opportunity and vulnerability, enabling expansion while demanding constant negotiation with geological constraints. And as one emerges from these shadowed corridors into the bright, sculpted terrain above, where fairy chimneys and cliff dwellings echo the subterranean forms in inverted relief, the impression endures that Cappadocia's underground labyrinths are best understood not as hidden cities or monolithic refuges, but as cumulative expressions of survival, community, and environmental adaptation, their mysteries lying less in secret chambers or uncharted depths than in the subtle interplay between human agency and a landscape that both facilitated and constrained every decision carved into its yielding stone, leaving the full story of these vast networks suspended somewhere between historical memory and the quiet persistence of the volcanic earth that shelters them.